At my husband's funeral, a stranger leaned close and whispered words that froze my blood. I will never forget the way his breath touched my ear, the way his eyes refused to meet mine. That whisper cut deeper than grief, heavier than the hymns rising in the church. Before I reveal what was said, tell me in the comments where you are watching this from, because every story of betrayal has a place, and mine begins here in Atlanta. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 67 years old. For 45 years, I was married to Robert Carter, a man the community admired as a pastor, a leader, and a servant of God. To the world, Robert was a saint. To me, he was a husband I could never truly reach, a man who hid behind sermons and scripture while leaving me in the shadows of his carefully constructed image. The church that morning was heavy with incense and memory. Stained glass windows cast colored light on faces bowed in reverence. The choir sang softly, their voices trembling with loss, while neighbors and church members filled the pews. I sat in the front row, hands folded tightly, the widow everyone pitied. Yet beneath my black veil, pity was not what I felt. I felt suspicion, anger, and the sting of words I was never meant to hear. Robert's coffin rested before me, polished oak reflecting the dim glow of the candles. People wept, spoke kindly of his generosity, his guidance, his devotion. Each eulogy struck me like a hammer against glass, widening cracks I had kept hidden for years. They praised his faith, that faith is nothing when secrets rot underneath. I knew, deep down, that Robert had lived a life built on lies. And now, in death, those lies were slipping through the cracks. The stranger's whisper was not an accident. He had sought me out deliberately, bending low as if offering condolences, but delivering poison instead. I caught only fragments, but the meaning was undeniable. Robert wasn't the man you thought he was. He left more behind than you realize. My body stiffened, my fingers clenched the hem of my dress, but I did not turn to look. Grief can be faked. Shock cannot. I remained still as the service continued, my silence hiding the storm within. Around me, the congregation prayed for Robert's soul, unaware that another story was beginning. Betrayal does not die with the body. It lingers, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to cut again. That morning, as the last hymn faded and the coffin was prepared for burial, I realized my mourning would not be for the man I lost, but for the years I wasted believing his mask. I had given Robert everything: my youth, my strength, my patience. When we married, I was only 22, full of dreams of earning a doctorate in literature, of traveling to cities I had read about in dusty books. Instead, I became the pastor's wife, expected to stand behind him, smile politely, and raise our daughter Angela while he rose higher in the church. My life became the scaffolding for his reputation. The sacrifices piled quietly, year after year. When money grew tight, it was my savings from teaching that kept us afloat. When his sermons demanded time, it was my hands that prepared meals and arranged gatherings. Robert was the voice. I was the silence behind it. People admired him for the stability he provided, but that stability was built on my exhaustion, on the choices I abandoned, on the years that slipped through my fingers like sand. Angela never saw the truth. To her, her father was a man of wisdom, a leader admired by everyone. I did not want to spoil that image, so I played my role, always smiling when she was near. She asked me once why I never pursued my dream of teaching at a university. I lied, saying I preferred to stay close to home. The truth was that Robert's ambitions left no room for mine. His shadow stretched long and heavy. Even as I grew older, my devotion was never enough for him. He criticized small details: the way I dressed for church, the way I hosted dinners, the way I prayed. His words chipped at me slowly, reminding me that in his eyes, I would never measure up. Yet to the congregation he was flawless, a shepherd guiding his flock. No one saw the cracks but me, and even I tried to convince myself they weren't there. The whisper at the funeral awakened memories I had buried. The times Robert returned home smelling faintly of perfume. The late nights spent in his office with no explanation. The envelopes of cash tucked into his desk that never appeared in our accounts. I dismissed them as accidents, coincidences, flaws of a busy man. But now, with the stranger's words ringing in my ears, those fragments assembled into a truth I could no longer deny. This story is not only about grief, it is about years of sacrifice offered to a man who never deserved them. And if you think you understand where this is heading, you do not. Stay with me until the very end, because the truth buried beneath Robert's life is darker than the grave itself, and its revelation will cut deeper than death. I had been Robert's shadow for nearly half a century, the unseen force behind every sermon he delivered. People admired him for his wisdom, for his strength, for the way he held the community together. They never noticed the sacrifices that built that image. Those belonged to me. My ambitions faded into silence, replaced by endless acts of service, each one erasing more of the woman I once dreamed of becoming. When I was young, I wanted to study further, to teach, to write. Books were my escape, my hope, my promise of a wider world. But marriage to Robert came with expectations. His path as a pastor required a wife who stood beside him, polished and dependable, who gave up her own light so his could shine brighter. I abandoned Paris, abandoned New York, abandoned the classrooms I loved, because Robert's needs always outweighed mine. The community never saw my exhaustion. They saw dinners hosted, events organized, a pastor's wife who seemed endlessly patient. Behind closed doors, my hands ached from work, my nights were sleepless, and my spirit shrank. Robert praised me in public when it suited his image, but in private he criticized relentlessly. The dress too plain, the prayer too soft, the dinner not warm enough. My sacrifices became invisible, while his reputation soared higher with every passing year. Angela, our daughter, believed her father was a pillar of integrity. I encouraged her belief, protecting her innocence. She asked once why I had given up my dream of teaching at a university. I smiled and told her I chose a different path, one closer to home. In truth, Robert's ambitions consumed everything, leaving no space for mine. I wanted her to admire him, even if it meant burying the truth deeper inside myself. But the whisper at the funeral cracked the silence I had lived in. A stranger's words confirmed what I had always suspected, but never dared admit. Robert's life was not one of holy devotion. It was one built on secrecy, on deception carefully hidden beneath scripture. The odd smells on his clothes, the unexplained absences, the hidden money, they were not flaws to overlook. They were evidence of a man who lived behind a mask. I realized then that my grief was not only for Robert's death, but for the years I had wasted serving his false image. This is not a story of love lost. It is a story of betrayal exposed, of decades sacrificed for a man who never deserved them. And if you believe you already know how this ends, you are mistaken. Stay with me until the very last word, because the truth will cut deeper than the grave. The service ended, but the stranger's words followed me like a ghost. As mourners filed past Robert's coffin, offering handshakes and murmured condolences, I could barely hear them. My focus was fixed on that whisper, its weight pressing heavier than grief itself. Robert wasn't the man you thought he was. He left more behind than you realize. The repetition of those words hollowed me from the inside, louder than the hymns still echoing in the church walls. I watched his colleagues from the clergy approach, faces solemn, voices reverent. They spoke of Robert's goodness, his guidance, his faith that never wavered. I smiled as tradition demanded, but every word tasted of ash. Their admiration was built on lies I had lived with, lies I had endured, and now the mask was crumbling. It was humiliating to sit in silence while they worshipped a man I knew had betrayed not just me, but them as well. The humiliation deepened when I noticed Martha, Robert's sister, avoiding my eyes. Her fidgeting hands, her hushed conversation with another relative, all betrayed knowledge she had chosen not to share with me. In that moment, I understood that the secret whispered to me was not mine alone to uncover. It was already known by others. The realization stung worse than the betrayal itself. I had not just been deceived. I had been excluded from the truth. When the coffin was carried to the graveyard, the air outside was sharp, the sky grey with the weight of storm clouds. As the pastor spoke final words over Robert's body, I could barely hear him. My mind churned with questions I had never asked, questions I feared the answers to. Who was Robert when he wasn't standing behind the pulpit? What had he left hidden beneath the surface of our marriage? As the dirt began to fall onto the coffin, I clenched my hands together, my nails digging into my palms. The stranger's whisper had cracked something in me, but the silence of those around me shattered it completely. They knew something I did not. Robert had carried secrets to his grave, but he had not carried them alone. The humiliation of being the last to know burned hotter than any grief. I walked away from the graveside with a steadiness that surprised even me. The mourners saw a widow, quiet and composed, but inside me raged a fire that grief could not quench. The humiliation had carved itself into resolve. Robert may have taken his secrets into the ground, but I would dig them back up, piece by piece, no matter how painful. And if betrayal humiliated me, vengeance would redeem me. If you've ever tasted humiliation that demanded justice, share this story now. That night, the house was unbearable in its quiet. The walls that had once echoed with Robert's sermons, phone calls, and footsteps now pressed against me like stone. I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, staring at his empty chair. The stranger's whisper circled in my head, louder in the silence than any voice I had ever heard. My grief was real, but beneath it, something sharper stirred. I could not cry. The tears would not come. Instead, I sat motionless, my hands locked together until the joints ached. I remembered nights spent waiting for Robert to return home, telling myself he was visiting parishioners, comforting the sick. In truth, I knew nothing of where he went. Silence had been the language of our marriage, and now, in death, it had become my prison. But prisons can also become furnaces. The following days blurred into routines performed on autopilot. I cooked meals I did not taste, folded clothes that would never be worn again, and walked through hallways that felt foreign to me. Each object in the house whispered reminders of the life I had sustained for him. Suits pressed, sermons typed, meals prepared. Yet now the silence revealed those acts for what they were. Offerings to a man unworthy of devotion. My stomach churned with disgust. Angela called from Dallas, her voice warm, asking if I was holding up. I lied as always, saying I was managing, that the community had been supportive. She told me she wanted to visit soon, but her job kept her tied. I said I understood, even as my voice cracked. I wanted to tell her everything, to confess the secrets crumbling around me. But silence won again. It clamped down on my throat, forcing me to swallow truth. At night, I began speaking aloud, not to Robert, not to God, but to myself. The words were jagged, trembling at first, then stronger. You betrayed me. You humiliated me. You lived a lie and made me part of it. The walls absorbed my fury, and for the first time in years, I felt power in hearing my own voice ring out. Silence no longer suppressed me. It carved me into someone new, someone unrecognizable. By the end of that week, the grief that had threatened to drown me had transformed into something darker. The silence that once suffocated me now sharpened my resolve. I no longer feared the truth. I hungered for it. If the trail had bound me, vengeance would set me free. And if you've ever felt silence turn into rage inside you, leave a comment with one word: strength. Because silence can wound, but it can also forge steel. One morning, I woke with a clarity I had not known in years. The grief had stopped gnawing at me. The silence no longer pressed on my chest. Instead, something inside had crystallized into resolve. I went to the drawer where I kept Robert's papers, the same place where I had hidden the funeral program and the folded note I scribbled with the stranger's words. My hands no longer trembled when I touched them. I read the notes I had written after the funeral, the fragments of memory that had begun to resurface. Receipts for hotel stays, cash withdrawals I could not trace, unexplained absences. Each piece of evidence was small, but together they painted a portrait of betrayal. I whispered aloud, "Robert, you thought I would never see you for who you were. But I do now. And it is my turn to decide what remains of your legacy." In the kitchen, I studied the photographs lined along the wall. Smiling family portraits. Robert with Angela at her graduation. Robert shaking hands with church leaders. Every frame was another mask he wore, another lie I had helped polish for the world. For the first time, I felt no sadness in looking at them. I felt power. Those images might have fooled others, but they could no longer fool me. And that knowledge was intoxicating. The phone rang that afternoon, a parishioner checking on me. I let it ring until it stopped. I owed nothing to their sympathy, nothing to their illusion of Robert as a holy man. For decades I gave my voice to his reputation, silenced my needs for his ambition. But silence had reshaped me. Now it would serve me as a weapon. I was no longer Evelyn, the loyal pastor's wife. I was Evelyn, the keeper of his downfall. That evening, as dusk fell and shadows stretched long across the floor, I sat with a pen and notebook. I began to write not sermons, not prayers, but a ledger. Every sacrifice, every insult, every humiliation I had endured. I wrote dates, places, details, the truth carved out like scripture. By the time I finished, my hand ached, but my heart was steady. This was not mourning. This was preparation. Vengeance does not always arrive with fire and fury. Sometimes it begins with ink on paper, with a decision whispered to oneself in the dark. That night, I folded the notebook closed and placed it beside my bed. Robert had lived his life building illusions. I would spend the rest of mine dismantling them. If you believe secrets demand justice, subscribe now, because what comes next will not be silence. It will be reckoning. The confrontation did not come in shouts or accusations. It arrived in silence, as it always had, but this time the silence belonged to me. Martha, Robert's sister, came to my house days after the funeral. She carried a casserole in her hands, but her eyes betrayed unease. When we sat at the table, I placed the notebook I had filled before her. She froze. I said calmly, "You knew, didn't you?" Her lips parted, searching for excuses, but I did not allow her the chance. "You knew about the hidden money, about the child he fathered outside this marriage." Her face paled, her hands clutched at the casserole as if it could shield her. She whispered, "Evelyn, we didn't want to hurt you." My voice remained steady. "You did not protect me. You protected his lies. And now I will protect the truth." She began to cry softly, but I felt nothing. The woman who once would have comforted her had died alongside Robert. What remained was someone sharper, someone unwilling to cradle anyone else's guilt. I told her, Robert lived as if his sins were sacred. I will not bury them with him. Martha begged, please, don't destroy his memory. I leaned forward and replied, his memory destroyed itself long before the grave. The power shifted in that moment. For years, I had been the listener, the forgiver, the silent partner. Now Martha sat before me trembling, her tears soaking the dish towel in her lap. I studied her, not with malice, but with the cold curiosity of someone who had finally learned how to watch rather than endure. She realized I had no intention of retreating. I had become what Robert feared most, a woman who no longer feared him. That night, I burned the casserole untouched. I stood by the stove and watched the cheese bubble and blacken, the smoke filling the kitchen. It was symbolic, wasteful perhaps, but necessary. I would no longer swallow what was handed to me in place of truth. I was done consuming other people's lies disguised as comfort. The smell lingered for hours, sharp and bitter, but it felt like cleansing. Confrontation is not always about raised voices. Sometimes it is about a gaze that does not waver, a truth spoken without hesitation, a refusal to bend when bending wants to find you. That day, Martha left my house shaken, her casserole dish empty, and I remained in the quiet glow of victory, no longer the widow to be pitied, but the avenger to be feared. If you have ever confronted silence with truth, share this story now. In the weeks after Martha's visit, the quiet of my home became a stage where collapse revealed itself. Robert's allies avoided me now, their calls less frequent, their voices hesitant. Word spread quickly that I was not the grieving widow they had expected, but a woman asking questions no one wanted asked. The same men who once praised Robert's virtue began to shift uncomfortably when his name surfaced. Their silence betrayed their complicity. Martha returned one evening, her eyes red, her hands trembling. She confessed what I already knew. Robert had a son with another woman, a boy now grown, living in a town not far from ours. She whispered, Evelyn, please let it rest. He is gone. Nothing good will come from this. I answered coldly, something has already come from this. The truth. And unlike Robert, I will not bury it to protect appearances. The collapse of their defenses fed my resolve. I watched as Robert's carefully polished reputation began to tarnish. Whispers in the congregation turned into doubts, doubts into rumors. I did not need to raise my voice. I let their own unease destroy the pedestal they had built for him. For decades, I had been his shield. Now, by stepping aside, I allowed his false image to crumble under its own weight. Angela called again, her voice heavy with concern. She asked why people were speaking strangely about her father. I paused, then said gently, your father was not the man you thought he was. There are things you deserve to know, but only when you are ready to hear them. She pressed for answers, but I remained firm. For now, I would let her see the cracks on her own, because truth, once revealed, can never be undone. At night, I walked through the house with a strange calm. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind through the curtains reminded me that collapse was not destruction. It was transformation. Robert's secrets had been the foundation of this family, and now that foundation was crumbling. The dust settled around me, but instead of choking, I breathed deeper. The collapse of others became the air of my freedom. Power is not always seized with force. Sometimes it comes when others surrender under the weight of their own guilt. Robert's allies were fading, his reputation withering, and even his family was fracturing beneath the truth. I did not strike the blow, but I had placed the mirror before them. If you have ever watched lies collapse without lifting a finger, like this video now, because collapse is the truest form of justice. I began to measure the cost of my devotion, not in vague feelings, but in numbers, in memories, in sacrifices that had names and dates. 45 years of marriage had drained me of more than youth. It had stolen the woman I could have been. I had given up graduate school, turned down teaching opportunities, and replaced dreams of Parisian streets with the dust of church basements and endless suppers cooked for Robert's flock. The ledger in my notebook grew darker as I wrote. $10,000 from my retirement savings, gone to cover debts, Robert never explained. Hundreds of nights spent alone, while he disappeared with excuses that no longer made sense. Birthdays and anniversaries reduced to obligations, not celebrations. I wrote them all down, line by line, as though recording evidence for a trial. And in a way, it was a trial one where the verdict was long overdue. Angela called me once more that week, asking how I was coping. I told her calmly, I am counting. She did not understand, and I did not explain. How could I? How could she grasp that I had spent decades carrying the weight of Robert's failings on my back? That I had financed his illusions, excused his absences, and built a life that belonged more to his ego than to my soul? Silence was easier than explanation, but the silence no longer hurt me. It sharpened me. I looked back on the countless lies I had swallowed to protect him, the humiliations endured in public, the betrayals endured in private. I felt no pity for myself now. I felt clarity. Robert had treated me as disposable, but the truth was that it was he who had wasted his life on deceit. My sacrifices had meaning, because they would fuel his undoing. Even the house betrayed the cost of my loyalty. The walls I had painted, the furniture I had polished, the garden I had tended all bore my labor, my devotion, my patience. Yet Robert's shadow darkened every corner. I walked through the rooms and whispered aloud, "This was never yours, Robert. It was always mine." My voice echoed, and for the first time I believed it. Ownership was not in his name. It was in my survival. The total price was staggering, but it did not crush me. It freed me. I no longer mourned what I had lost. I claimed it, turned it into fire, into steel. Robert had taken everything, yet in exposing him, I had reclaimed more than I ever imagined. If you have ever counted the sacrifices you made for someone unworthy, leave a comment with the number, because every tally tells a story. And mine is finally being heard. The day I stopped mourning was the day I felt truly alive. I no longer dressed in black out of duty to Robert's memory. I wore colors again, bold shades that he once dismissed as improper. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw not a widow defined by loss, but a woman reborn in defiance. Grief had been my mask. Now vengeance was my crown, and it suited me better than sorrow ever did. Robert's name still floated in conversations around town, but the reverence was gone. People spoke with hesitation now, their voices laced with doubt, their eyes turning toward me for answers. I gave them none. Let them wonder, let them speculate. Let them unravel the myth he built with their own suspicions. Silence, once my tormentor, had become my weapon, and it cut deeper than words ever could. His collapse was complete, and I didn't lift a finger. Angela eventually came to me, her eyes searching, her voice trembling. She asked directly, "Mother, who was he really?" I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "He was not the man you thought he was." She pressed for more, but I stopped her with a single sentence. "When you are ready to know, you will find the truth yourself." She wept, but I did not. The burden of protecting Robert's image had died with him. In the quiet of my evenings, I walked through the garden, breathing air that felt cleaner than it had in decades. I thought of the girl I once was, full of dreams, eager to live, silenced too soon by a marriage that devoured her. That girl was gone, but from her ashes I had risen stronger. I whispered to the wind, I survived you, Robert. And surviving you was the greatest victory of my life. I no longer carried rage in my chest, only resolve. His betrayals had tried to break me, but they had forged me instead. For every lie he spoke, I built a truth. For every humiliation he gave me, I carved strength. Robert's grave held a body, but his sins walked freely in the stories I carried. Stories I would never again hide. Power was mine now, born not from his shadow, but from my fire. So this is where my story rests, not in mourning, but in liberation. Robert was buried by pallbearers, but I buried his lies myself, one by one, until the earth above him was heavier than stone. If you have listened this far, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because betrayal may wound, but survival transforms. And sometimes, the sweetest revenge is simply living louder than the silence they left behind.